So we've done a series of these, but we're trying to keep relevant. So we sort of change the title when it feels like there's something else different to say. So at the moment we're focusing on what can we do and what we think the future might look like whilst we wait for more guidance. But just very quickly, I think most of you know me, but if you don't, I'm Sarah Threlfall from Brightspace Events. My background is as an event director in large event management agencies. And then I set up Brightspace Events 6 years ago, working for those agencies, but also for others across the industry, loads of different clients, loads of different event types. And all the way through that career, I've been doing risk assessments and event safety plans and, you know, all the health and safety practical experience. And then since this time last year, I've decided to turn all of that practical experience into qualifications. So I've been doing loads of study and I've got a couple of IOS certifications now, and I'm still waiting for my final results for the NEBOSH professional qualification, which is due in 3 days. So hopefully I can stop saying that soon and actually just start saying I'm qualified for all health and safety. But so the COVID focus was very natural for me. And what I've been doing is lots of third-party webinars, and actually the majority of the content that we've got here was developed in one that I did with MiceBook. And they actually had a lawyer on who specialises in regulatory compliance, and we got his insights on, you know, what the legislation means and what's behind the regulations, kind of thing. So that just gives this an extra bit of context, really. We're going to talk about guidance and what you're allowed to do and all that sort of stuff. It does obviously come with huge disclaimers that this is all correct today, right now. It could change tomorrow. We're hoping we get a week's notice of any changes. But yeah, just make sure that you're checking that. The other really kind of important thing is to make sure you're clear in your head and according to the government guidance what it is you are doing and who you are. Because the various different guidance documents kind of cross over for a number of things. A good example is a historic venue that's doing an event, because you've got your own sort of historical venue guidance. It could have some rooms and therefore be operating under hotels guidance. It's a venue that could be doing business events under their guidance. You might want to do a concert, which is a performing arts guidance, and then you're a visitor attraction, so you've got some stuff in the visitor economy about, you know. So there's a huge amount of dependencies there, and equally what you're doing, you know, is it a drive-in event? Is it a performance? Is it a business event? Is it a training course? So it's really important that from the very beginning, you're happy that you've followed those different flow charts, you've come up to the answer as to what you are, and then you're looking at the correct guidance to make sure that you're complying with the regulations and the legislation. So what I'm going to do is quickly just share my screen. So somebody shout if it doesn't appear. But the main thing that we're focusing on at the moment is we have these steps. The steps dates are no earlier than, so this is the best case scenario. Touch wood, we're on track so far. Dependent on 4 tests, so the vaccine rollout, the vaccine efficacy, the infection rate's still dropping, and any variants of concern. And at the moment, we're good on the first 3. It would be the variant of concern is the thing to watch in terms of the Indian mutation particularly, but touch wood. We've got lots of pilot events that are happening at the moment. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. The legislation that we have in place at the moment that has informed this grid. So me and Nick, the lawyer, looked at the legislation that we've got so far, and that is in place up to the 30th of June. And we are expecting it to be revised at each step. What we don't get is a sneak peek of what's coming up. This is also based on what's included in the Working Safely guidance. So there's lots of information there about practically what you can and can't do, and also how you're supposed to do it. And it's also been informed, this grid, by some guidance that was issued to local councils from the government about licensing decisions and what they should be allowing and what they shouldn't be allowing in terms of SAG planning and that sort of thing. So it's a kind of a mixture of things that's come up with these answers. There's a fuller version of this on MySbook's sister site, which is mustbeonit.com, if you want to see the full background. But basically, you know, we're in step 2 at the moment, and at the moment we're okay for outdoor events as long as there's no congregating, so no focal points. But apart from that, it's really only inspections. And to be honest, even inspections have caveats about what you can inspect and what you can't inspect. So just be careful on those. When we hit step 3, so the 17th of May, this is when we have a big step change in terms of numbers. So the caveat to these step 3 events is that we are to absolutely plan for all the normal, as they are now, COVID secure measures. So full social distancing, masks to be worn, and you know, a risk assessment in place that covers anything else and all the other things that we might need to do on site. So they're much bigger numbers, but still with a full, what I would call your full COVID secure precautions in place. So indoors, we're looking at up to 1,000 people or 50% of the capacity. The really good news is that they've included, and they've specifically made reference to private dining and gala dinners and banquets, because before they used to sideline those and deal with them differently, and they were never, you know, they weren't allowed when other stuff was. But at the moment, they're saying that they are going to be allowed in line with all the other business activity. But they will still need to be socially distanced. So the, you know, the benefit of doing them starts to fade slightly, I think, personally. But and then outdoor events, again, you can go up to 4,000 and you can start having congregations. So you can start having a screen or a performance or a central arena where people will gather. And then step 4, apparently we can do anything and everything that we want to, with no legal restrictions on numbers or gatherings. So the caveats there is that, as I said, we don't get the legislation until much closer to the time. So if you're organising anything that's close to those transition dates, be careful and also be prepared for the fact it might delay. So you need your kind of worst case scenario based on the previous steps conditions. The numbers don't include staff workers or volunteers, and particularly for outdoorsy kind of festivals and carnivals, until we hit step 4, the stipulation is that the events can't take place if it's unlikely that social distancing can be maintained. So really kind of boozy events or really uncontrolled public events, the councils have been told not to allow those because social distancing must be maintained. And then when we get to step 4, like I said, everything hopefully with the appropriate mitigations in place, restrictions on numbers will be lifted. We are now looking at England only. There are different rules in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and I'm happy to guide people through those if they need to. Just shout me after this. And all events must comply with COVID secure guidelines and have a risk assessment in place. The other thing to be very wary of is that in the other regulations, which has been shorthanded to the step 3 regs, no. Anyway, that's left my brain. There's health protection regulations which stipulate that the local authority have powers to close down events on the grounds of public health at any, you know, just according to their own risk assessment, not yours, according to their risk assessment of your event. And they can do that up until, at the moment, 17th of July at the earliest. So the advice is to make sure if you've got anything that's relatively large or just unusual, or it's a first for that venue or a first for your kind of area and it's very public, make sure you're talking to your local authority really early to have a two-way conversation about what's going on. We've seen in the past they can be quite nervous and they cancel things like the boat show very last minute. They have issued new guidance which kind of says, please don't knee jerk, please make sure you talk to an organizer before you shut them down. It needs to be, you know, a considered decision. However, it ultimately will come down to one person at the authority whether or not your event can go ahead. So there is a bit of a sword of Damocles kind of hanging over our neck until that regulation is either removed or changed to give a higher burden of proof. I think would be nice if we could have something that was a bit stronger rather than one person's view. So that kind of covers what's allowed and what's planned in our roadmap. But of course, it does all depend very much on the results of the event research programme. Now, that is what the government are running, which is organising the pilot events that we're seeing happening literally as we speak, which is quite exciting. So but they're all massive numbers. I mean, frustratingly, you know, we kind of think if they could have done some smaller ones and released, you know, up to 500 people or something, that would have helped. But anyway, this is how they're doing it. So we've had a few football events already with up to sort of 4,000, 8,000 people. Obviously, you're outside. It's a kind of a very different arrangement to us. But they are also doing the snooker with an indoor audience. So that one is very relevant, I think, to what we do. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And then tomorrow is the big business event. So in Liverpool, they're hosting an event for 1,000 people at the ACC, and the idea is that they'll take that as a pilot to see what measures are going to be needed for the future, and what guidance is going to be updated for beyond the 21st of June. Now, there's also nightclub stuff, outdoor cinemas, and more football coming up in May. But the interesting thing about what the conditions that they're running the pilots in, for me, is a great thing to look to for how they're probably going to want us to operate. So the controversial thing is that they're not using any form of COVID status certification, and I'm deliberately using that phrase, not vaccine passport, which is what the press keep calling it. So COVID status certification, the important thing about this when it's proposed or discussed is that there's two ways you can get a successful status certification, either vaccination or a negative test. And I think that's really important, because a lot of people, because this is the word that's used here, vaccine passport, and instantly you do have queries about ethics and compelled medical procedures and Disability Act and equality legislation. So, you know, if it is just one route, then it is fraught with difficulty. But I think I've listened to some webinars with some lawyers and some people who are far more qualified in this than me. And the general consensus is, as long as there's more than one route, it's kind of okay. But they're not using COVID status certification for these tests. What has happened since they said that is that various organisations in our industry, so the AEO, the MIA, the AEV, you know, who are all the people who are driving the guidance and driving this kind of communication with DCMS and the government, they've written an open letter to say that they want COVID status certification as a measure to kind of encourage opening up the industry. I think they're worried that if the government say, well, we're not going to have it, it could delay everything. Whereas putting it in place is a really strong measure that reduces the likely severity of the impact of the hazard, because you've potentially got a mostly vaccinated audience, or you've reduced the risk of people being infected and infectious because they've had a test. So, you know, it's a double whammy in terms of risk reduction. So they're going for it in terms of lobbying, but at the moment it's not included in these pilots. The thing that is included in the pilots is testing. So everybody who attends these pilot events has to have a lateral flow test, and it just sort of says they have to bring evidence to or demonstrate to the organizer that they've had a negative test. They don't specify what the bar is for that. I don't have details on breakouts and things like that, but as far as I understand it, they're trying to operate it as much as a normal business event as possible. So for my mind, that would be a large plenary session, a few breakouts, a lunch break, a coffee break, arrival registration. That's my understanding of it. Martin Fullard from Conference News is going and is committed to live tweeting tomorrow, so that could be something to follow just to see what he says. And there are more details about it in terms of the content, if you like. It's actually it's a real genuine event that they're sharing business strategy or something, but I can't remember exactly what it is. Has anyone got any other questions?
There's an interesting one there actually from Susan. Susan's daughter's attending a Liverpool Nightclub pilot event on Saturday, so that's exciting.
Waiting Susan to grill her on how that kind of.
I know, I'm so annoyed that she's in uni in Liverpool, so she's managed to. The tickets did cost £40, though, which apparently is very expensive. And I says, well, welcome to the real world. And everything opens up and you're back out socialising again. That's kind of the price of stuff, kind of thing. But yeah, she's attending on. It's this Saturday coming. Yeah, I don't even know where.
Okay, because I mean, that's obviously the really high risk one in terms of audience behaviour, audience profile, close quarters, drinking. I mean, that really is the top end of the scale. So that will be interesting to see what happens. And I'm interested as well because I did read early on when they first announced the programme, but they hadn't launched the details, that the comedy club pulled out because they said they were going to use the COVID status certificates. And the comedy club were like, no, we're not doing this because we don't agree with it. But they've obviously, done a bit of a U-turn on that and said that they're not using them anymore. So I wonder if that's kind of, I think the nightclub was threatening to pull out as well. So I wonder if that's how that's come back online. So Denise, lateral flow as a means of testing. It's a good way to screen for asymptomatic infection. And it will reduce the likelihood that somebody's infected in your audience. It by no means gets it to a point where you can relax other measures. You can improve the reliability of them by using trained medical staff to actually do the test, but you still only knock into sort of 70%, I think. I've just asked for some new stats actually, because I'm doing testing next week somewhere. But the Innova ones that the government used when they did their big test, it was kind of coming in around 60%. So you're missing 4 out of 10 positives with those lateral flows. So yes, they're definitely not diagnostic, and they definitely won't let you release your other measures because you've got no guarantee. But it will screen 6 out of the 10 will be picked up. And yeah, I think PCR is definitely the recommended if you're doing routine screening, so like TV sets and close contact people like makeup artists and things like that, then the protocol is repeated PCR testing every 2 or 3 days, so that there's that really is the gold standard, if you like, of testing. Anyone else got questions either on testing or the pilot events or the grid in terms of numbers and what you are and can you do it and can't you do it? Feel free just to jump in as well. Okay, well I'll go back onto my slides and just cover the next bit. Okay, so this is the kind of crystal ball bit, but we do start with what we know. So we know that the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 isn't going anywhere, and that spawned, that's the wrong word, but that gave way to the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regs 1999. So these are our normal health and safety at work legislation, and they both put a responsibility on an employer to ensure a safe working environment for their staff and other people who are affected by their work. And specifically, Regulation 3 says that you must make a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And then Regulation 5 says that you need to write it down if you've got more than five or more employees. Now, ironically, early on in the pandemic, the DWP actually got investigated for not social distancing and not being a COVID secure workplace, and they were found in breach not of the coronavirus legislation, but they were found in breach of the Health and Safety at Work Act and the management regs. And they had to pay costs for the investigation and all sorts. So even without all of the coronavirus regulations, even if that all disappeared tomorrow, which is obviously not going to, we've still got this responsibility under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So the regulation for coronavirus regulations, which is this health protection coronavirus restriction steps England regulations 2021, that also includes a very specific legislation that gives us the responsibility or a requirement to do a risk assessment. It goes on to say not just do a risk assessment, but to take all reasonable measures to limit the risk of transmission, and that we must follow all government guidance. So the guidance that normally is quite informative but doesn't have many teeth, it usually just tells you how to comply with legislation. In this instance, it's specifically referenced, which gives it a bit more weight. And historically, sort of this health protection regs have changed many times throughout the pandemic. This requirement has stayed fixed. Sometimes it's section 7, sometimes it's section 6, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 5, but it's always in there. So it's incredibly unlikely that they will remove it when they remove all the limits on numbers. So people who sort of think, oh, well, on the 21st of June, it's just all going to go back to how it was this time last year. Well, it's even more than that. It's 18 months now, isn't it? It's very unlikely that's what's going to happen. We have responsibilities existing under health and safety at work regulations and in the coronavirus health protection legislation to do risk assessments and to keep people safe. So what I can see happening is that although, on the face of it, it might look like a relatively normal event to the guest, they don't have to social distance really, or they're not aware that they're social distancing and they don't have to wear a mask. But behind the scenes, the event organizer and the event designers and the client and the venue have done a ton of work to make it feel like that for the guest. Clever distancing tricks to keep people apart without them realizing that they're being kept apart. There's all sorts of things that will be happening behind the scenes, and it's going to come down to us to do that. Specifically, these regulations talk about the gathering organizer and the manager. And, the definitions are a bit vague. The gathering organizer is the person responsible for organizing the gathering. Thanks for that. Nice and circular. The manager is a bit more specific. So it says it's the management of the premises on which the gathering takes place. So for me, that's a very clear direction that this is a joint effort between planner and venue. This isn't, oh, the venue's going to do it all, or, oh, well, the organiser's got to do it all. This has to be done together, and it has to be bespoke for each event because the risk profile is completely different for each event as well. So that's the kind of the foundation, if you like, of the legislation and the regulations. So I've already talked about it quite a lot. It's what we think will happen. The point about face masks and social distancing is that it is a completely separate issue to the steps and lifting restrictions. The government publications have said that face masks and social distancing will be reviewed for step 4. They're covered under separate legislation. They're covered under separate regulations. So just because we're allowed to meet in vast numbers, it doesn't mean that we can do away with social distancing and do away with face masks at all times. We don't know yet. So worst case, as I said right at the very beginning, is plan for social distancing just in case it doesn't go as quickly as we are hoping it goes. I think there's a few things that will definitely change in terms of how we communicate and how we operate. I think safety information going out with your invite is going to become very normal. I think people want that confidence to attend. They want your reassurances that you're, taking it seriously, but also to sort of appreciate that people's risk in terms of what they're happy to do in their personal life versus what they're happy to do for work is very different. So I know at home, if my light bulb goes, I just jump on a chair and I hang off, you know, one leg like that, one arm up there, just trying to get it like that. If I did that on site, I'd be thrown off for breaking God knows how many risk assessment measures. We have to behave differently at work than we do at home. So just because everyone's out in the pubs drinking and not social distancing, blah, blah, it doesn't give us carte blanche to just let them all do that at our event. So I do think that there's going to be higher standards expected of us. And there's going to be a expected compliance. You know, there's going to be, what's the word? There's going to be an expected level of measures. People are going to have what they want to see at events. You know, they might want to get tested. It might not come from the government. That might be driven by the public deciding that actually they don't feel safe unless they've been tested on arrival. So you may end up with some measures that are actually driven by what's, you know, the perception of measures and the perception of safety. But I think the legal compliance is going to focus much more on the employer to do the risk assessment and to do the measures and to limit the capacity and all that sort of stuff, rather than the government dictating how many we can do. But I still think there's going to be a requirement to look at it, definitely. But I think really what I absolutely hope will happen is that it all just becomes less onerous, less important in terms of health and safety, and it becomes part of your normal risk assessment. Whereas at the moment, it's a completely separate assessment. I would hope that if the infection rates just stay what they're doing, vaccine rollout does what it's doing, we can start to just add COVID as a relatively short section at the end of existing risk assessments. And the measures, therefore, that go with that will become a lot less and a lot easier. And a lot more normal and expected, and that's just what people do, you know. So you haven't got as many issues with compliance either, because it's just the norm. So there's a few places to go to for information and guidance. I've already talked about the government's Working Safely information, and the industry have issued lots of different guidance notes as well. So for the hospitality industry, the food industry, the film industry, and that basically tells us how to work, you know, how to actually take this stuff into practice. Although, as I said, we don't have any indications of what's coming, unfortunately. But in short, if you want to know where to go and get all of that, you can head over to our website, which I should have put on there. Just Google Brightspace events and hit the COVID-19 button, and you can sign up for our info hub. And then when new stuff comes out, we'll send you an email that you know, tells you to go and check out what's there. We've also got a couple of training courses. Some of you have even been on them, so I won't talk about those for too long. But if you do want to know more, we've got an online only awareness and introduction course. And we've also got a more detailed workshop based course that deals with physically carrying out risk assessments and then writing them down. So it is new, you know, this is new for everybody, and even the most experienced agents and companies going back to live at this point will be doing it for the first time. So if we can help in any way, please do let us know. We do lots of consultancy. We've been doing it throughout the pandemic. We've just confirmed a couple more clients. We're on site next week. So if you do kind of need some support, either setting up your policies and your framework, we've done that and we're doing that for another couple of people. Or if you actually want a support on a specific assessment on a specific event, then we can do that for you as well. But I'm happy to stay on. I'm aware that I've run out of time, but if you guys want to ask any questions, please do.
We've got a question, Sarah, in the chat, just with regards to legislation. What's the current expiry date for coronavirus health protection legislation? I know it can be extended again.
Yeah, from memory, I'll double check. My notes say that it's the 30th of June for this one, which is the bracket steps. But we are expecting that to be amended and reviewed at each step. So it will be updated. But interestingly, yes, they've already built in a 9-day lag in the 21st of June to the 30th, which is when the regulations actually expire.